Hello and welcome to our reading and reflection for Sunday the 20th of September 2020. We've got one verse that we're going to look at and think about and try and make sense of, and it's challenging. It's not easy, but well, that's what we're here for. It's from Philippians, Paul's letter to the Philippians. It's chapter 1, it's verse 29. You have been given the privilege of serving Christ, not only by believing in him, but also by suffering for him. Paul says you've been given a gift, you've been given a present, and the present you've been given is suffering. Great, got your present. Oh, thanks, what is it? Pain. No thanks. What does it mean? Why does Paul say this? What's going on here? Paul says here and elsewhere that suffering is a gift from God. Suffering is a gift from God. Now, Jesus is the Son of God, and Jesus teaches us, tells us to call God Father. The language he uses for God and the language he tells us to use for God, chiefly, for example, in the Lord's Prayer, our Father who art in heaven. So you might think of God as Lord, Master, some sort of cosmic boss, as it were, a superior being, and if he chose to give pain to people, well, who are we to complain or comment? But when someone that we think of and refer to as Father gives us the gift of pain, well, there's a disconnect, there's a problem. We have difficulty squaring that. Why would somebody's dad give them pain as a gift? As a gift, cause them, not even just cause them pain, but anyway. So what's Paul saying here? In particular here, Paul is saying that the pain that the Philippians are undergoing, the suffering, is as a result of being Christians. It is not general suffering that befalls everybody sooner or later, one way or another. Neither is it their own fault. They haven't brought this upon themselves through poor choices, bad decisions. This is persecution for being Christians. And it's worth remembering here that right now, as you are watching this, Christians are the single biggest persecuted group in the world. Fact. We've had a lot lately, and it's been good and it's been right, and I've supported it. We've had a lot lately, Black Lives Matter. Can't argue with that. Black Lives Matter. And the church, I hope, I like to think, I believe the church is at the forefront of combating racism and discrimination and oppression and exploitation. But it's Christians, it's the church that forms the single biggest group of persecuted people, of those discriminated against, marginalised, and oppressed. Have a look at the website for an organisation called Open Doors. Open Doors. They are fantastic at advocating for the persecuted church, at raising awareness, and all I can urge you to do is to be aware. Be aware, make others aware, pray, and give money. Give money. These people, fellow Christians, are our brothers and sisters, and they are persecuted through no fault of their own, simply for being Christians. And that's what Paul is talking about here, that the Philippians are suffering for being Christians. Paul talks about suffering elsewhere at length in his other letters, and indeed in this letter too. He says, this is, by the way, when Paul talks about suffering, I've now moved away specifically from this one verse, which is to the Philippians, and it says, you have this gift of suffering, but the Philippians are suffering for being Christians. Elsewhere, Paul talks about suffering for being Christians, for their faith, but also in the general sense. Life happens, and sometimes even in specific ways in which people bring suffering upon themselves. But Paul talks quite a deal about pain, trouble, suffering, regardless of the cause of that suffering. Paul says, for example, if we want to share in Jesus' glory, then we must expect first to share in his suffering. Jesus Christ sets the template. He sets the sequence. The pattern is cross, resurrection. No resurrection without first a crucifixion. That's Romans chapter 8. He says, for example, that if we share in Jesus' sufferings, Then Jesus shares and strengthens us in our sufferings. When we suffer, Christ suffers with us, empathetically. But more than empathetically, somehow he is present in us and with us, and he feels and shares our pain. And when we suffer, we are, in our own small way, sharing in his suffering, in his crucifixion. So suffering brings us closer to God, closer to Jesus Christ. Suffering doesn't just bring us closer to God, it brings us closer to other people. When you are suffering, you want, hope, expect people to reach out to you, to support you, to care for you, to show you love and to help you. And when others are suffering, that gives you the opportunity to do the same for them. Suffering should call forth a loving response. So it doesn't just make us closer to God, suffering can make us closer to each other because it makes us vulnerable and weak. And that's another thing that Paul talks about when he talks about this thorn that he has in his flesh. We don't know what this thorn is. It's the metaphor that he uses for presumably some physical, medical problem that sounds painful and debilitating. And he says to God, please take this problem away, please heal me. And the implication in Paul's thinking there is, make me well, make me strong, make me fit, make me healthy, then I can work all the better for you. Then I can serve you. I can look after the church, I can preach the gospel, I can do good works, I can be a happier, healthier individual and a better servant of God. And Paul says no. God says no. God says, no, Paul, I'm not going to heal you. Because when you have this problem, your weakness makes you a better person. It makes you need God more. It makes you vulnerable and humble. It makes you ask for and accept help from other people. So I could fix you, but then you end up proud, you end up self-sufficient, and this little problem that I allow to persist, that keeps you humble, weak, and vulnerable, makes you actually a better human being. So suffering can change us. The trouble is, suffering sometimes changes us for the better, and sometimes for the worse. Paul said it stopped him being proud and self-sufficient, but other times suffering can make people angry, bitter, resentful. Sometimes suffering makes people anxious and fearful. Sometimes suffering, it can make people actually less empathetic. It can make people more selfish and more self-absorbed. So it can be not always a change for the better, but suffering does change people. And we hope that in general, but for Christians in particular, suffering, not pleasant as it is by definition, and without in any way wanting to minimize it, diminish it, or justify it, I hope suffering does make us better people. But it doesn't always. It doesn't always. And I'm not always very good at suffering myself. I do become, some of those things that I mentioned. We look for people to blame. We blame ourselves. We blame other people. We blame God. We actually become less sensitive to the suffering of other people when we are in pain. Sometimes the way that suffering makes us better is not at the time, because at the time what we need to do is to receive help. We're not always really in the best place to give it. But when we've come through suffering and hopefully to some measure of resolution and healing and health and out the other end, the scars may remain, but the wounds have healed. And it's with our scars that we're able to empathize and sympathize and perhaps be a better person to other people who are suffering, particularly if they're suffering in the way in which we suffered. Christians should suffer well. That should be the mark of a Christian. Jesus Christ himself suffered well. Unfortunately, we don't. I don't. But we're each of us a work in progress. And I hope that we are making progress. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I know that for my own self. Finally, the last thing to say is this. Paul says God has given you the gift of suffering. Well, thank you very much, God. I was really hoping for that. It was top of my Christmas list. Why would God give the gift of suffering? Well, we've looked at some of the I don't want to say benefits, and I don't want to say upsides of suffering, but we've looked at some of the good fruit that suffering can produce. And it is really easy to pontificate about suffering when you are not going through it yourself. And at the moment, okay, this morning, here I am, Sunday morning in church, it's a beautiful autumn day, I'm in a pretty good place. But I haven't been in the past, and there'll be times in the future when I'm not again. And at the moment, it's very easy to philosophize, to find the good in the bad, etc., etc. But the point is this: suffering is not good, it is not pleasant, but hopefully the best that can be said for it is that good can come out of it. But why would God give the gift of pain to his children? Why would a father do that? Well, a better translation would be, rather than to say, God has given you the gift of suffering, full stop. Really what Paul is saying here in this one verse is, God has given you the privilege of suffering for and with Jesus Christ, his Son. God has granted you the honour of sharing in Jesus Christ's suffering and of having Jesus Christ sharing your suffering with you and for you. It's an honour, it's a privilege, rather than the gift of suffering. Here's the present of pain. Well, thank you very much. No, it's the honour, it's the privilege of sharing in the suffering that Jesus Christ himself is the template and pattern of. And sometimes I, as a father, and we call God Father, I, as a father, cause my children pain and suffering, and sometimes it's not unintentional. We all make mistakes. I'm a human being, so I know that I've hurt my kids in the past, and my parents hurt me, and their parents hurt them. But as long as fundamentally we know that what the other person wants for us is the best, and they've just screwed up because they're human, well, the wounds don't go too deep. But sometimes I do intentionally and deliberately hurt my children. How and why? Well, that's a shocking thing to say. What I mean is something like this: I will tell my children to do something they do not want to do. Tidy your bedroom. Toddlers and teenagers, I've mentioned them before. Oh, if you ever want to see humanity at its worst, take a toddler and a teenager on a bad day. Sometimes it's not that I ask them to do something that they don't want to do. Sometimes I don't help them with something that they're struggling with. They have a problem, and I could probably fix it fairly easily. I've got a lot of experience, I've got a shed full of tools, I've got a bank full of money. I could probably pretty much get my kids out of most fixes that they get themselves into. Mostly, not all, and of course as now they're becoming older. But when they were younger, they would struggle with something, and I would not. I had to resist my temptation to rush in, solve the problem, because I want them to learn resilience and resourcefulness. I want them to try and figure out the problem for themselves. And if I leave them long enough, well, they may not figure it all out, but they might make some progress. And then I will come along and help them, that's the theory, help them complete what they have begun. I could do it myself, but that doesn't help them to learn and to grow. God wants us to learn and to grow. The gift of pain, well, perhaps we should think of it as the honour, the privilege of sharing in the suffering of Christ, and of having Christ sharing in our suffering with us. God bless you.